Hello, I'm Sydney and welcome back to my Flock and Squawk. So you can tell by the title of the video, this is block 2 of my block of the month. If you're interested in block 1, I'll link the playlist and you can check out more on my blog, flockandsquawk.com. So let's get into it. I'm going to be going straight into voiceover, so if you want more info, check out those places.
So if you haven't seen my previous video for block 1 or read my blog post, basically I put in the number of shelves I have, that picks my shelf, then I put in the number of books on that shelf, it picks my book, and then from there I put in the number of pages in that book, and then I get my block. I skip over advertisements, I skip over whatever is non-applicable to creating a singular block. So in this case, we got a book called Hidden Block Quilts, Discover New Blocks Inside Traditional Favorites. It's on Amazon still. It's about $20. I recommend it. It's very straightforward if you know what you're doing. I would say a beginner to intermediate is still safe. You might need some help with some of the piecing, but that's what YouTube's for. That's what people are for. I definitely wouldn't have needed help if I had this at an earlier stage of my sewing career, but what we ended up with is a block from the Gamecock's block Quilt. I ended up choosing block A because the page spread had a set of 4 blocks for this. I went with block A, it was the leftmost block, and as you can see, it is very straightforward instructions. There's not writing explaining every detail, which is why you might need some help with creating this if you're a beginner. And so if you pause at the right time, you might be able to find the instructions for measurement and cutting. I did not include that in the scan pictures because I don't want to infringe on any copyright, but if you pause at the right time, you might be able to catch it, or you can go through the process of the math, that using math in order to figure out the size of what everything should be. Just know that you have to add 1/2 inch to every measurement in order to account for seam allowance. And then also another part of this project is that I'm picking fabrics out of my stash. In this project, I think I ended up 100% cotton and steel. All of it is older lines from when the original designers of cotton and steel were still there. Like there's Penny Arcade fabric, there's the black and whites, there is the Beauty Shop, which I used 2 fabrics from. The strawberries are beautiful. I basically went in and looked and decided that I was going to do a theme of food fabric. Like there's candy, there's water, which isn't necessarily a food, but it kind of went. There's strawberries, there's popcorn fabric. I basically just picked what suited me, and then I just went for it. As you can tell on my final block, I ended up needing more fabric with contrast next time. That was an issue I also had with block 1. But I kind of basically went through and I cut, I pressed my fabric, then I cut it. It doesn't actually need that much fabric. I thought it probably needed more, which is why you see me cut like extra strips of the first fabric. But it doesn't actually take that much fabric for just one block. You basically are cutting about like 1.5 inch strips for most of it into like 4 little squares that are like 1.5 by 1.5. So it doesn't take that much fabric. The largest piece that I cut was probably 2.5 by 2.5, and it ends up being around a 10-inch finished block. So if you're doing the math to figure it out, that kind of gives you an idea. I did my best to film the cutting from multiple angles so you can get an idea of how I cut. I use the 2-ruler method. It's how I was taught. I think it's very straightforward and easy, and you don't have to worry about the lines on the cutting mat. And then for sewing, and then when I was cutting my fabric, you can use, there are pins that where the pin head is numbers and letters. You could use that to keep your fabric straight, because when you're cutting so many small pieces, it's easy to get them confused or forget, okay, I have so many squares that are 1.5 by 1.5. Which fabric was I meaning to be this? So I basically, as I went, I cut, or I wrote on a piece of paper, like A, and then I would pin that to my fabric A pile. And then I would continue and do that for all of them, so that way I had it straight. And then when I go to sew, you see that I bring up the image again. I basically had my book open to the page, and then I laid out my pieces, so you might be able to see, like, step 1 is you sew B and D together, and it says to make 4. So I put my B and D fabrics together aligned like that on my cutting mat next to my sewing machine. And then I had C, I, and G laid out in the 4 square that it shows for step 2. So I had my cutting mat kind of laid out like that. So as I was sewing, I could just pick up the pieces and know exactly what I was doing. If it's harder for you, then you probably would want to cut just the B and D and then sew those, and then cut your next for the step 2, which might be easier for some people, or you might have a different method that you want to try. That's up to you, but that's how it works for me. And then I tried to get a couple different angles for sewing in, but it's kind of difficult to figure out how to best position the camera for people. But when we get to the triangle corners of where it's on step 4, you sew squares to the edges of piece J in order to make little triangles at the corners. To show that, I basically broke it down. I have this little ruler piece. You don't need it. You can just use a normal ruler and line up the corners of your squares. You place the square right sides together on top of your rectangle, and then you line up the corners to the line in the ruler. So it's the 1/4 inch line is lined up, so your edge of the ruler. And then I take a friction pen, which disappears with heat. Take a friction pen, and then I draw the 1/4 inch line, and then you line up your sewing machine foot to that, so that way that is a 1/4 inch. That's not where you sew, that is the line to line up for your seam allowance. I try and show it here. I'm not really confident in how well you can actually see it, but I think it's clear enough that you can tell that I'm not sewing on the line that I drew. That is the line for my 1/4 inch. And on my sewing machine I have a little bit of tape that marks out my 1/4 inch seam allowance, because sewing for this, I cannot use the sewing machine foot with the fence. It pushes the fabric into my feed dogs. So I use a normal flat sewing machine foot instead of my 1/4 inch seam foot. But yep, so I just sort of sewed away, tried to get a good view of everything, and let me know what you think. I really enjoyed making this block, so I hope you enjoy it too. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you so much for watching. So as you can tell, this is, or as you can see, this is my block. I have a little bit of problem with contrast in picking my fabrics, but I still think it's super cute. And if you want to see more pictures of it, that's on the blog. If you want to wait, if you're interested in block 3, stick around. That'll be in a couple weeks. But next week, I have a special sweet treat surprise for those of you who are interested in baking. I am going to work on a project regarding chocolate chip cookies. So stick around. The blog post will be coming out next week, as well as the inaugural video. I post on Sundays over here on YouTube, Saturdays on the blog. So thanks for watching.